G'day everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Why We Should Give Flake a Break. I'm Dr. Leonardo Guida. I'm a shark scientist and the shark conservation lead here at the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome and thank you all for attending this webinar. I look forward to explaining why we should give flake a break, having some really good discussions, and also getting a chance to answer some of your questions. And before we start ahead, I will say that when it comes to questions, I'll aim to answer as many as I can. But unfortunately, we've got a limited amount of time. But suffice to say that just drop your questions in the comments, and over the course of the next week or so, I'll aim to address as many as I can in as much detail as I can. Again, thank you all for coming. I hope you've all got a nice beverage nearby, whether it's a glass of wine, beer, water, some biscuits, some crackers, whatever takes your fancy. Sit back, relax, and hey, here we go. So just give me one moment and I'll just launch the presentation itself. One moment. Okay. All righty. So, as I said, we're going to talk tonight about why we should give flake a break. If you like, you can follow me on Twitter. I've got my handle ElasmoBro down there on the left, and also on Instagram at Elasmo_bro. So, on tonight's menu, first we're going to cover, or basically I'm going to provide you some food for thought. And what we're going to look at is sharks and rays across the world, but more specifically the Australian context and the sharks and rays that live here in this country, or in our waters, I should say. Then we're going to pretty much get to the guts of it, and that being the fact that we're eating endangered species and we don't even know it. And for those retailers, they might not even know that they're selling it. Then the cost of shark fishing is bycatch. So whenever you buy a flake, you might want to consider if you want some dolphin with that. So we'll look into bycatch and the issues around that. Once we get an understanding of sharks and fisheries and the issues that we face, we're going to actually look at on the ground. Once we know what's happening at sea, we're going to look at on the ground, your local fish and chippy, your local seafood market. And I get a national snapshot of exactly what's available and what other alternatives there are and how we can best support our retailers and also our local fishers doing a great job. Then there's going to be probably the most controversial question of the night, and that is, can shark meat be sustainable? Once we've delved into that, we'll then look at some solutions and really get into how Give Flake a Break can actually help. And the three things that you can do tonight and over the course of the next few weeks or however long you want to help spread awareness, take action, and ultimately ensure that our endangered and threatened species recover, we have healthy oceans, and for those that do enjoy seafood, that we can fish into the future whilst having these healthy oceans. So let's move into it. So around the world, there's around 1,200 species of sharks and rays. It's an incredible amount of diversity. And in Australia, we have around about 1/4 of them, 328 to be precise. This makes us a biodiversity hotspot globally. So around the world, by that, I mean that there's a lot of varied species of sharks and rays in our waters. And of those 328, half of them aren't found anywhere else in the world. So we're in quite a privileged position, quite a unique position. And the onus is really on us to ensure that these sharks and rays have a healthy future and remain in healthy numbers. The IUCN Red List has classified sharks as the most threatened form of marine life on the planet. So 37% of all shark and ray species around the world are threatened with extinction. This is pretty damning considering it was only, from memory, 5 to 10 years ago, that number was 25%. So action needs to be taken, not just around the world, but here in our own country. And the main reason for these threats is overfishing. When we look at Australia specifically and we zoom in, many of the world's imperiled species are doing relatively well in Australian waters. So that's a good thing. We have largely intact coastal ecosystems, we're relatively isolated, and we're a well-resourced country, which means that we can actually have the resources and the talents to look after our fisheries. But as you can see on this chart here, particularly if you look at the red and orange colours, there's some serious problems in our backyard. So when it comes to sharks, they breed slowly and they're vulnerable to fishing pressure. Most sharks, and this is generally speaking across the spectrum, but most sharks will mature at about 10 years of age. They'll produce 4 to 6 offspring, and they'll do so every 2 years. In Australian waters, we've got 6 shark species that are in decline, 2 of which, the tiger shark and the short-fin mako. We've got another 18 species that are overfished. This includes the great white shark, the endangered scalloped hammerhead, the endangered school shark, and the critically endangered whitefin shark. And to make matters worse, we eat some of these endangered sharks and we might not even know it. And as I said earlier, retailers might not even be aware that they're selling them. So again, we go back to this species list. Now I've just highlighted the critically endangered in the red and the endangered in the orange. And if we look at the species that are endangered or critically endangered that are fished and sold, we have the critically endangered whitefin spall shark. This is a species that is found nowhere else in the world, just in Australia. So if it disappears here, it's gone globally. And really, no one can save it but us. We've also got the endangered scalloped hammerhead, which is a global species that occurs all around subtropical Australia. We've then got the endangered school shark, which again occurs around the world, mostly in your cooler waters. So here in Australia, also in South America and the southern part of Africa. And another unique species only found in Australia, the Australian long-nosed skate, which is critically endangered. For the whitefin spall shark and long-nosed skate, there are no rules with regards to their protection. Just that. There's no rules in place to protect these species. For example, there's no catch limit on any one of these species. When we look at the endangered scalloped hammerhead and the school shark, there's a loophole in our national environment laws, what's commonly referred to as the EPBC Act. Within our national environment laws, there's a category called conservation dependent. Now, this is amongst other categories like endangered, critically endangered, and vulnerable. But the loophole about critically endangered is it allows the commercial exploitation of endangered fish that would otherwise qualify for protection under this law as endangered and therefore not allowed to be taken. I will stress that in this category, there's 8 fish and there's only fish in this category. The idea about this category essentially is so long as you can rebuild this species and recover it without disrupting commercial activity. But if you ask me, it's a little bit like communism. Works great in theory, fails in practice. Because the problem is that with regards to scalloped hammerhead and school shark, they haven't shown any measurable signs of recovery. And when you look at the school shark, its numbers have declined by about 90%. Some other issues. There's no legal obligation to actually label the shark bite species. Now, we say flake, and flake is a catch-all term for shark meat that's been used since the 1920s. However, flake should only refer to gummy and rig sharks which are not endangered. But this practice is voluntary. And as you can see in these images here, you've got a fish and chip shop calling school shark, again, an endangered species, flake. And you've got another fish and chip shop. You might be able to see this if you look quite closely, but it's baby boneless shark for only $11.90. Now, Greenpeace also did a DNA test of shark meat in 2015 in Victoria, and they found that 7 of 9 stores in Victoria were selling school shark as gummy shark. So again, there are these issues here that shouldn't really be here. The other issue is you don't even have to label where it comes from. Now, South Africa presents a great case. So if you look at the map on the left of the screen, you'll see that there's a marine protected area in South Africa called the De Hoop Marine Protected Area. What you want to take away from that image is that there are dots fishing in that marine protected area for similar species that we find here in Australia. Again, within this area, they have school shark, like we do, and they have a sister species of the gummy shark called the smoothhound shark. Now, when you look at these species, they're predicted to be commercially extinct in as little as 40 years in South African waters. South African waters is widely acknowledged in this fishery. There is poor fisheries management and there's unsustainable fishing practices impacting the populations of sharks in these areas. But when you look at the graph on the right, you'll notice that in 2016 through to 2019, thousands of kilograms were imported directly to Australia from these fisheries. And thereby, once they end up on our market, we are implicitly supporting unsustainable fishing practices that are affecting the ecosystem in another country. Now, there's been quite a lot of controversy and suspicion that these fishing practices here have actually driven the disappearance of white sharks from False Bay as of 2015. Coincidentally, when Australia started importing a lot of shark meat from this fishery. It made the news worldwide, here in Australia. Now, again, it's a hypothesis. Some have said, oh, it's probably because of the orcas, because orcas do prey on great whites, and studies have shown that orcas can basically scare the hell out of a great white and cause it to disappear for a few months. But in the context of this, the impact of an orca is its relatively short-term absence. We're looking at the absence of great whites from False Bay for years. I think up until now, I think there's maybe only been 2 or 3 sightings or thereabouts. But suffice to say, more or less disappeared from the area. Now, whether or not that's directly because shark meat from there is ending up on our plate is one question. But either which way you cut it, unsustainable fishing practices look to be impacting the broader ecosystem in South Africa. Now, zooming back out a little bit, we're importing shark meat from a fishery that's unsustainable. So it's a bit like the pot calling the kettle black. So let's have a look at some unsustainable fishing practices that are happening here in our very own waters. And so next time you go to Waterflake, you might want to think if you want dolphin with a side order of that, because again, with unsustainable fishing practices, it's about the broader ecosystem impacts. And it's possible that the shark you're ordering comes at the cost of another threatened or endangered animal. So in Australian fisheries, gillnets are the predominant method of catching sharks. And as you can see in this picture, that's what a gillnet looks like. It is a net. Now, gillnets are designed so that they catch a certain size class of shark. So basically, in a nutshell, they're designed so that they catch juveniles and not the large reproductive active sharks. However, as you can see in this picture, bycatch is a massive issue when it comes to gillnets. And if we look at Queensland, this is probably almost as bad as it gets really by Australian standards. So in Queensland, you can have up to nets up to 1.2 kilometres in length that fish in the Great Barrier Reef for sharks. Now, these nets catch turtles, dolphins, dugongs, and on top of that, in these fisheries, there's no independent observation, which means there's no cameras or there's no human observers on board to accurately see what's going on, to double check the logbooks are accurately reported. So in essence, it's happening quite literally out of sight, out of mind. And it's widely acknowledged that underreporting of bycatch of threatened species is rife. And as you can see on this screen here, between 2012 and 2018, it's estimated that there were 422 dolphins caught versus the reported 5, 422 dugongs caught versus the reported 19, and 14,700 turtles caught versus a reported little over 1,000. And you'll see on the bottom of the screen there in tiny writing, there's a reference there to a media release we did a while ago, and that'll explain how we came to these figures. Because we've got to remember, during these years, there's no real accurate way of double checking the logbook. So these are estimates, but nonetheless, it's a rough indication of how much underreporting is going on. That being said, it would be remiss of me to not mention where incremental improvements have been made. And this is thanks to governments of the day. It's thanks to conservation work. It's thanks to people like you who've supported these actions. And it's thanks to the scientists who do the incredible work that we need to have the evidence to support these actions. But that being said, some of these incremental advances, they're just that, they're incremental, and they're not nearly enough just yet. So most recently in 2021, Queensland reduced the number of sharks that can be caught on the East Coast by up to 20,000 sharks per year. This equates, it's 100 tonnes, which roughly equates to 20,000 sharks per year on the East Coast. That includes the Great Barrier Reef. But there's no species-specific limits. So you could catch, there's no cap on tiger sharks, for example. You could catch as many tiger sharks as you want, so long as overall nothing exceeds that 400-tonne overall limit of sharks that can be caught per year in Queensland. Our Commonwealth fisheries in 2019 have a dolphin mitigation strategy. And as the name suggests, this is a strategy put in place so that we can reduce the numbers of dolphins being caught. But this is currently failing, and we believe it's in urgent need of review. From 2019 to mid-2021, 95 dolphins have been caught, a number far too high to suggest that we're doing a good enough job. In 2018, in Western Australian shark fishery, there was endangered sea lion closures put in. This is just over 17,000 square kilometres worth. Now, this is desperately needed, and this is a good move, but there's still no baseline estimation of the population of Australian sea lions in that area. So we can't measure the recovery of sea lions. We don't know whether these closures need to be expanded or not. Now, this is a particular grave concern, given the Australian sea lions have reduced their populations by 64% over the last 42 years and are now endangered. So now we know what's happening at sea. We're aware of the issues. So let's have a look at what's happening on the ground and what difference that we can make with our choices and where positive change can be made. We did a report and we surveyed 70 fish and chip shops across the country. So this was about 10 from every state. And of those, we found that less than a third of shops, or less than a third of the meat on offer was actually labelled by the shark species. The good news is that sustainable seafood is accessible, generally speaking. A little over 40% of all the fish and chip shops, a little over 40% of the surveyed shops sell a sustainable alternative. And as you can see in this image here, there's also a breakdown on the right of the states. The other good news is that the availability of sustainable seafood is actually pretty good. So a little bit over the third of the fish and chip shop menu actually has a sustainable alternative. Again, if you want a breakdown of the states of where you're located, that graph there shows you the way. The great thing is that the concern for a healthy ocean and access to sustainable seafood is becoming the norm, if not may already be the norm. And what we've found in our research, and again, the references are down on the bottom left, that half of Australians are actually willing to pay more for sustainable seafood. 8 in 10 Australians are willing to take action in any sort to ensure that we have healthy oceans. And 7 in 10 Australians would switch from shark meat to a sustainable alternative once they've been made aware of the environmental issues. So such as the stuff that we've been talking about just immediately prior to this. Now, when we have a look at options, there's some on the left there. Feel free to take a screenshot of the screen or with your phone, just a quick reference next time you go to local fish and chippy. But the good news is that the difference between eating an endangered shark or a sustainable alternative on average across the country is $2. It will vary state to state, but on average it's $2. So this means you can still support the fish and chippy and the local fishers who are doing a good job. Now, I preface the fact that I understand that some people don't like seafood and don't want to eat seafood, and that is perfectly fine. If you're on your journey to understanding seafood and more sustainable choices, this can assist you. And I also understand that for some people, $2 might break the bank. Again, it's entirely your choice and no one should judge you for it. I'm just presenting some information here to help you make a choice that sits well with you. Now, we've had a look and we've shown how shark fishing, its current form in Australia, is ecologically unsustainable. But now let's ask a really controversial question, and that is, can shark meat be sustainable? Well, yes, but, and so I know some of you might be jarring at this, but it is possible, but, and we think of this because anything can be sustainable really when you think about it. Everything has a biological limit, so long as it doesn't exceed that limit and it declines and it can still replenish itself. That limit may very well be only 1. It may be 10, it may be 1,000, it may be 1,000,000, depending on what it is. So when we look at sharks, there's about a handful of species that have been identified as potentially sustainable. And these are typically smaller coastal species. So we're looking at spot-tail sharks and blacktip sharks, which typically are subtropical in Northern Australia and tropical Australia, and gummy sharks, which are in Southern Australia. So there's a handful of species that we can look at. But we also have to remember that when we think of sustainability, it's not just about the number of any given fish. Sustainability means what are the broader impacts? What are the environmental impacts? What's the holistic outcome here? What about bycatch? And we touched on it earlier, but if we look at some of these species, we realize that gummy comes at the costs of school shark, which is endangered. And we realize that black tips getting caught on the Great Barrier Reef come at the cost of turtles and dolphins and dugongs. The other thing we really have to look at is traceability. And this goes back to our South Africa story, because ultimately it can be anything from anywhere. So even if there was a fisher operating at best practice, which there are, he or she can't distinguish or isn't able to distinguish with confidence in the market from, sorry, let me rephrase that. They can't distinguish themselves with confidence in the market from anyone else that they are a sustainable fishery, because there's no law in place that says you have to label where your fish product comes from. So in short, all fishes are getting painted with the same brush, which isn't fair. So let's have a look at a bit of a case study. Let's use gummy shark as an example as to what a green listed gummy might look like. And when I say green listed, I say this in reference to the Sustainable Seafood Guide of Good Fish, which we use for our report, and that you can use in your day-to-day actions to understand and help you choose what seafood is sustainable. So if we're looking at a green listed gummy, on the left, you'll have now. So this is the current situation. And on the right, you'll have those changes that would improve that fishery. Now, I will say that these changes aren't necessarily all the changes that have to happen, but they are some pretty crucial ones. So for one, we look at the school shark. When you fish the gummy shark, you're inevitably going to catch school shark. So it's important that school shark are protected as endangered species and that a trigger level is set so that once too many die, the fishery closes. Now, at the moment, there's no trigger. And previously, from memory, right, the year escapes me. I think it was as recently as 2018. I'll have to double check, and I'm more than happy to write in the comments once I have a look. But the TAC was increased, and the fishery had, and the amount of school shark caught exceeded the limit, and the fishery wasn't closed. Also, the limit has to be set in such a way that the species can recover above 20% of its original numbers. So currently, right now, it's at about 10 to 15. Recover above 20% of its original numbers much faster than the original anticipation of 66 years. So this limit was set in 2012. So we've now got about 50 odd years to meet this target. The science is telling us it's not going to meet that target. And quite frankly, if we stick to that goal, many of us probably aren't going to be alive to see if it works. I know I'll certainly be pushing it because I'll be hitting my 80s or thereabouts. So it has to happen much faster. Fortunately, the science is currently being evaluated and new limits are going to be set. We just hope and pray that it's robust enough that it can happen a lot faster. The other thing we can look at is the gear we use. So we can possibly shift from gill nets to long lines. Now, long lines aren't without their evils. However, generally speaking, in terms of volume of bycatch, you would assume that it would be less. And when it comes to school shark or other shark species that are caught on long lines, the stress they experience is generally a lot lower than gill nets. And so they're more likely to come up alive in better condition and can be released alive. The other thing is we might look at smaller scale fisheries. So small boutique fisheries in coastal waters that don't catch too much can possibly even charge a little bit extra for their product because it's a premium and it's ecologically sustainable. It's a great sort of business option for fishers to look at and also retailers. And again, as we touched on earlier, the important thing is it has to be traceable. Currently, when you go buy shark meat, there's no way of telling what fishery it's come from. So if we have traceability and labeling in by law, a fisher can then with confidence go out and say, it comes from my fishery, you can trust me, I'm doing a great job. There's no wool being pulled over your eyes. So I want to bring up this quote. It's at the bottom of the paper written by Terence Walker. And the paper asks the question, can shark resources be harvested sustainably? Now, this sentence is the very, very last sentence in the paper. And I'll be honest, I didn't properly read it or have it sink in until I was actually preparing for this talk. And I've read this paper over and over again. It goes, there is no, and this, remember, this is the last question of an entire academic paper and study. There is no question that shark resources can be harvested sustainably. The question is, can shark resources be managed sustainably? So in essence, what that means is like what we said before. In theory, yes, so long as you don't take more than what any given species can handle, sure, it's possible. But the real question is whether we can manage it in such a way that it's done properly, we manage the broader environmental impacts, and it can be done effectively and properly over an indefinite period of time. But we're not there yet. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the problems that I've just highlighted. And the point is that we have challenges to address. The immediate one being, we have to stop endangered species being fished in the first place, and we have to reduce the amount of bycatch being caught. In the long term, we have to make sure that we have traceability in place and that it's legal, and it gives confidence to both fishers and the consumers, and obviously accurate species labeling. So I've put forward a case as to why we should give flake a break. But now the real question is, well, how does it actually help? Well, people power. By a lot of people doing this, it sends a loud signal that we need change, whether you're voting with your mouth, your wallet, or whether you're participating in conservation actions, be they petitions or be they spreading the word. It's got to get out there. People power will make a difference. We'll be able to stop endangered species being caught by changing our fishing rules. We'll be able to provide support for stronger nature laws so the species get the protections they deserve. And right now, Australia's nature laws are currently undergoing a once-in-a-decade review. So we really have a chance to make some significant change right now. And lastly, the People Power will support labelling and traceability, again, to provide that confidence of what something is and where it comes from. Now, if we give flake a break and you choose another type of fish, if you do like to eat seafood, a good question some people have asked is, well, why don't you just put pressure on other seafood and fish and damage them? This is potentially true. However, Australians have a narrow preference or taste for fish. You're probably listening and a few key species come to mind. They're typically Atlantic salmon, snapper, maybe flathead, and some kind of tuna. However, there are a range of other fish species that are caught as bycatch in a sustainable manner, but they're underutilised. Now, by underutilised, I mean that they're discarded because typically there's no market for them and they're of low value relative to the other fish that are being caught. I will stress that the catch or the bycatch of any particular fish species is sustainable and it is underutilised. It can't be just underutilised, it has to be sustainable as well. The other option, and an example of that could be ocean jacket. The other option is aquaculture. And farm barramundi is a really great example of that. It's ubiquitous. It's almost in any given state across the country. It's relatively inexpensive. The product is reliable and it tastes great. And also, aquaculture, farm barramundi. The other question, we get this a lot, and I've heard it a lot, is, well, shouldn't you just fix labelling laws? I mean, if it was an endangered species, I wouldn't eat it. Well, this is true, and it's very important. But that we fix labelling laws, it doesn't prevent the endangered species from being caught in the first place. It doesn't address the root cause. What addresses the root cause are nature laws and fishing rules and fishing practices. The other thing about laws is that they're inherently a very lengthy process, and rightly so. You have to get them right. Now, in 2014, there was a Senate inquiry that looked into the accurate seafood labelling laws across the country. And we're still waiting. Crickets, donuts, whatever you want to call it, nothing has happened. We're still waiting. The positive side of it, actually, is that at the moment, there are now discussions about country of origin labelling. Now, again, if we use our South African example, you would at least know if your flake or any other fish is coming from a fishery from another country, and you can then make a more informed decision. So 7 years ago, we had this discussion about labelling laws. Hasn't happened yet. Who knows how many more years ahead before something does happen. And this may be time that some species simply do not have. So we need to give them that breathing room. We need to give them that space, give flake a break, fix the fishing rules, fix our nature rules. And as an example of a species that doesn't necessarily have a lot of time left, or at least we don't know how much time it's got left, whitefin swell shark. Again, this is one that's only found in Australian waters. In 2003, it was recognised as near threatened. 2011, near threatened. 2019, critically endangered. Now, what's going to happen to this species in 2029, 2030? I don't know. All I do know is that myself, my team, AMCS, Broad Conservation Movement, Ocean Lovers are making sure we're doing everything we can to protect species like this, to ensure that they live long into the future. But remember, this is a species that has no fishing rules in place. It can still be caught and sold. And on average, you're looking at about 1,000 of these each year being fished. So again, It's really important that we understand how sharks are being fished in this country and take some action. So in terms of action, here's what you can do now. For one, there's a QR code there that has a petition that will help us reform Australia's largest shark fishery. There's a raft of rules that need implementing and or tightening to support the recovery of school shark, to support the recovery of the whitefin swallow shark and the long-nosed ray. Now, these are all the species I mentioned much earlier that are endangered or critically endangered. They're all caught in this fishery. So by signing that petition, you're adding your voice. Now, some people might say petitions don't really do much. Well, if it wasn't for people signing petitions, when I told you earlier about Queensland reducing its shark catch by about 20,000 sharks per year on the East Coast, that was because of you. That was because of people signing petitions. That was because of demonstrable support for action. So I suggest you sign that petition. And if you have any other actions you want to take, you can also ring the Environment Minister's office. But I stress, if you do that, please be polite. There are people on the other end of that line who are just doing a job, but nonetheless, express your concern and what you'd like to see happen. The second thing you can do is you can download the Goodfish app from goodfish.org.au. And that app there will help you inform any sustainable choices that you want to make next time you go to a fish and chip shop or any seafood market or any restaurant. The other great thing is on the website, there's a list of restaurants by state around the country that you can go visit and enjoy a nice seafood meal, guilt-free, knowing that you're supporting a healthy environment and also fishers who are doing a great job. And lastly, the third thing, probably the most obvious thing, spread the word. Share this link, let people know what you thought about this webinar. Just spread the word. And that way there, we can spread the shark love and really make some change. So with that being said, I'll just bear with me one moment. I'll just close this presentation. Okay. That being said, we're now going to open the floor up for some questions. I'll stress again, I'll do what I can to answer questions across the next 20 minutes. I apologize if I miss any, but rest assured, feel free to drop some in the comments. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, I'll aim to answer as many as I can in as much detail as I can, because I really would like to hear your thoughts and what you think might be a good idea for our fisheries to improve. And yeah, let's get stuck into it. All right, I have a question from Katrina. Why is school shark considered endangered when it's listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List? Is that just the Australian population that is endangered? Katrina, great question. So and you're pretty much on the money. So on the IUCN Red List, it's listed as critically endangered. And what that is basically it looks at it in a global context. It weighs everything up from where this fish is across the world. It says overall, in a global context, it's critically endangered. But as you've suggested in your question, when you zoom down and you look at Australian waters and the populations that exist in Australia, it's recognised as endangered by the IUCN Red List. And if you Google it, Shark Action Plan, there's a book there that lists all 328 species. It's freely available as a PDF. There's all species in Australia and their threatened status and why they're threatened that way and how the rankings work. But in short, yes, endangered in Australian waters, but in a global context, critically endangered. So again, this goes to say why we're in a relatively good spot, but we also have to demonstrate leadership and we have a responsibility to make sure these species don't disappear. Jeremy asks, what is a good alternative to shark meat? Now, this is a tricky one because shark meat's quite unique in terms of its taste, in terms of its texture. So this will vary on the individual. I myself am a bit of a foodie and I like experimenting with food. I like trying new adventures. I like trying new things. So as I mentioned earlier on one of the slides, there are other options like farm barramundi, King George whiting, and Spanish mackerel from the Northern Territory as well. Personally, a big fan of Spanish mackerel. But again, I suggest you download the Goodfish app. There's a range of alternatives in there. Cross-check that with your retailer. And also ask 3 really important questions to your retailer. What species is it? Where's it from? And how is it caught? That'll not only help you make a really good choice in the Goodfish app because it categorizes species by region and where they're caught, but it'll also start that conversation and retailers will then go, actually, if I want more customers and more business, I'm actually going to have to find this information out myself. I'm going to have to make sure I have this information. And then that flows on to inevitably positive change on the water and also in the marketplace. We also have another question. I had no idea flake was shark meat. Am I the only one? We actually did a national survey on that one. And it's actually surprisingly common how many people aren't aware that flake is shark meat. We actually found that 1/3 of Australians are not aware that flake is shark meat. So no, you're not the only one, and it is surprisingly common. Pablo has asked, is the presentation / PowerPoint available on your website? The PowerPoint's not a half bad idea, actually. But what is available is that this Facebook live stream is up indefinitely. So what you can do is you can go back, watch it, and from memory, I think you can manually drag the timer so that you can go to any slide that you want. So again, it's up there indefinitely. As for putting it up on our website, I'll ask the website team how we might go about that. It's a possible option. Good idea. Okay. Imogen has asked, is all flathead you see in restaurants the right type of flathead? I'm guessing the right type of flathead, meaning, is it the right species that's green listed, and is it the right species that comes from the right area? So again, it could be the right type of flathead. And this goes back to when you have a look at the menu, you can ask, is this a dusky flathead? Does it come from New South Wales or Queensland? How is it caught? And when you have a look at this information in the Goodfish app, you'll be able to you'll be able to say, well, I'll be able to make a decision based on that as to whether it's green, go for it. Amber, maybe eat a bit less, maybe not tonight, ease up, or red, avoid. So again, go to the app, ask those really 3 important questions. And again, that'll help you make a really good choice. Okay, we have another question. Why is flake even called flake? Again, a really good question. Sounds like a silly one, but it's a good one. My understanding is that it's called flake simply because of the way it falls apart. It falls apart quite flaky. I'm happy to be corrected on that, but that's all I know about that one. We're also looking at, let's see what we've got here. Could flake be chicken nuggets? So this is Jeremy. He's asked, could flake be chicken nuggets? Bit of an overreaction in parentheses, but because of labeling laws, how bad is this? To be honest, I don't know. I don't know the extent of laws as to ingredients in a particular product. So some products can be made up of multiple ingredients or multiple food sources or protein sources. To be honest, I couldn't answer that. But we do know from recent studies that looked at products around the world, such as cosmetics and even dog food, that endangered sharks, like the scalloped hammerhead, actually do end up in those products, in things like dog food and your cosmetics like lipstick and face masks and so forth. So sharks do end up in a range of products, endangered sharks as well. But as far as human food goes, like chicken nuggets, unfortunately, I couldn't tell you. Sorry. Okay. Still waiting on a few more questions. I understand it's quite a lot to take in. So don't feel pressured. Let it all sink in. But as I said, if you don't feel like asking a question right now, just write it in the comments and I'll get to it as soon as I can. So I suppose it might be worth asking you, the audience, how many of you have eaten flake? And after this webinar, would you consider changing your options? And it's okay to say no, it really is. I mean, ultimately, it's a personal choice, but it'd be really interesting to know. So I'll leave that as some food for thought and feel free to answer that in the comments. But other than that, I might wait a few more minutes. I acknowledge it's quite late at night and people's brains are probably fried. It's been a long day for me too. But again, I might cut it off there and just give a big thank you to everyone. Thank you for listening. I look forward to reading your comments and hearing your thoughts. And again, have a good one. Choose sustainable options if you're that way inclined, and have a good night. Thanks a lot. Take care.